Richard Harmon stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of his penthouse apartment. The face looking back at him belonged to a stranger, a man with slightly tousled hair, thin-rimmed glasses, and a 2-day stubble. Gone was the perfectly tailored suit, replaced by khaki pants and a simple button-down shirt that looked like it came from a department store sale rack. He adjusted the glasses one more time and nodded at himself. "Who would have thought I'd be nervous about walking into my own bank?" he whispered. For 12 years, Richard had served as the CEO of National Trust Bank, overseeing its growth from a regional chain to a national institution with over 300 branches. The corner office on the 32nd floor of the company headquarters had become his second home. From there, he'd guided the bank through the financial crisis, technological revolution, and pandemic disruptions. The quarterly reports always looked promising. Profits were up, expansion was on track, and shareholders were happy. Yet something had been bothering him lately. The numbers on paper didn't match the feeling in his gut. It had started 3 weeks ago during the annual leadership retreat. Richard had organized a dinner with the regional managers, hoping to hear honest feedback about operations. The conversation had been pleasant but utterly predictable. Everyone praised the new initiatives, nodded along to his vision for the future, and raised their glasses to another successful year. Later that night, unable to sleep, Richard had wandered down to the hotel bar. That's where he found Dave, one of the older branch managers who'd been with the company since before Richard took over. After a few drinks, Dave's carefully maintained professional veneer had started to crack. "You know what, Rich? I miss the old days, when we actually knew our customers by name, when we could make decisions based on people, not just algorithms and metrics." Richard had sat quietly, letting Dave continue. "The young tellers are burning out faster than we can replace them. They're getting squeezed from every angle. Customer service scores, transaction times, sales quotas. Half of them are working second jobs just to make ends meet. But headquarters only wants to hear the good news, so that's all we send up." The conversation had haunted Richard for days afterward. He'd built his career on being a hands-on leader, someone who understood the inner workings of his business. When had that changed? When had he become so disconnected from what was happening on the ground floor? The answer came from an unexpected source. A magazine article his wife had been reading about CEOs who went undercover in their own companies. The idea had taken root immediately. Richard had approached only 2 people with his plan: his wife Linda and his most trusted executive assistant Priya. Linda had been supportive but worried. "Just be careful what you find out. You might not like it." Priya had been more practical, helping him create a believable cover story about taking 2 weeks off for a leadership conference in Europe while actually remaining in the city. She'd also helped craft his disguise and backstory. He would be Tom Bailey, a recently relocated customer who had just moved to the city for a job in software sales. Now, standing in his bathroom in disguise, the weight of what he was about to do hit him. He was the public face of National Trust. His photo appeared in the annual report on the company website, even in occasional TV commercials. While not exactly a celebrity, he was certainly recognizable to his employees. The disguise had to work. His phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "Car waiting downstairs. Driver knows the plan." Richard took one last look at himself, grabbed his wallet with the fake ID Priya had somehow procured, and headed out. The first branch on his list was in a wealthy suburb, a showcase location that always performed well on paper. Richard deliberately arrived during the morning rush, joining the line of customers waiting for service. The branch was immaculate, with modern furniture and digital displays advertising the latest banking products. The line moved efficiently, and when Richard reached the front, he was greeted by a teller with a perfect smile and flawless customer service. He opened a basic checking account, making note of how many times the teller tried to upsell him on premium services. The process was smooth, professional, and utterly unremarkable. The second branch, located in a busy downtown area, told a similar story. The staff was well-trained and polite, though Richard noticed they seemed to be moving at an almost frantic pace. When he asked one teller how her day was going, she barely had time to answer before looking anxiously at the growing line behind him. By the end of the first day, Richard felt a mixture of pride and disappointment. His banks were running efficiently, yes, but there was a mechanical quality to the interactions that bothered him. Where was the human connection Dave had talked about? That evening, as he reviewed his notes in a coffee shop near his apartment, Richard added a new plan for the next day. He would visit branches in less affluent neighborhoods, places where the bank had expanded more recently. The next morning, he took a bus to a branch in the eastern part of the city, an area that had seen better days but was slowly recovering thanks to small business growth. The branch itself was smaller than the others, housed in an older building that the bank had renovated 5 years ago. As soon as he walked in, Richard sensed a different atmosphere. The line was longer, the space more crowded. 2 teller windows were open with a sign apologizing for the wait. Behind the counter, he could see a supervisor frantically talking on the phone while gesturing to a young teller who looked overwhelmed. Richard joined the line, listening to the conversations around him. An elderly man complained to his companion about the new mobile banking app that his grandchildren had installed on his phone. "Used to be I could just talk to Helen," he grumbled. "She knew exactly how I liked things done." "Helen retired last year," his friend replied. "All the old-timers are gone now." After 20 minutes in line, Richard finally reached the counter. The teller, whose nameplate read Kevin, greeted him with obvious fatigue in his voice. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I'd like some information about opening a business account," Richard said. "I'm thinking of starting a small consulting firm." Kevin handed him a brochure. "All the information is in here. The business specialist only comes to this branch on Thursdays, though." Richard pretended to look confused. "Oh, at my old bank, anyone could help with basic business accounts." Kevin lowered his voice. "Yeah, it used to be that way here too. But now they've specialized everything. Makes it harder for customers, if you ask me." He glanced nervously at the supervisor who was still on the phone. "Not that anyone asked me." "You seem short-staffed today," Richard observed. Kevin's professional mask slipped for just a moment. "We're short-staffed every day. 2 people quit last month and they haven't been replaced. We're told it's temporary, but that's what they said 3 months ago, too." Before Richard could ask another question, the supervisor appeared behind Kevin. "Is there a problem here?" No problem," Richard said quickly, not wanting to get Kevin in trouble. "Just asking about business accounts." The supervisor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "If you'd like to make an appointment with our business specialist, I can help you with that." Richard declined and left the branch, making notes on his phone as soon as he was outside. The disconnect between headquarters perception and branch reality was becoming clearer. The polished quarterly reports didn't mention understaffed branches or overworked employees. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Kevin and the elderly customer missing Helen. When had National Trust stopped being a community bank where relationships mattered? The bank's mission statement, which Richard himself had helped craft, emphasized building financial partnerships for life. But partnerships required trust and personal connection, exactly what seemed to be missing. The next morning, Richard decided to visit a branch he hadn't originally planned to see, a smaller location in a mixed commercial and residential neighborhood. According to the reports, this branch was performing adequately but not exceptionally. Richard was beginning to suspect that adequate might be hiding a more complex story. As he approached the branch, he noticed the simple but well-maintained exterior. Nothing flashy, just the bank's logo and hours posted on the door. Inside, the space was clean but dated compared to the showcase branches. 4 teller windows lined the back wall with only 2 currently open. Richard joined the line, observing the interactions ahead of him. The pace was steady but not rushed. When an elderly woman had trouble understanding her account statement, the teller took extra time explaining it, even though several people were waiting. Richard felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe the human touch wasn't completely gone after all. Little did he know that this unplanned visit would change everything. Not just for him, but for thousands of employees across the country. The true test of his leadership was about to begin, starting with a chance encounter and the sound of someone trying not to cry. Richard had been standing in line for about 15 minutes, watching the branch operate with quiet efficiency. Despite the dated interior, there was something different about this place, a warmth missing from the sleeker, more modern branches he'd visited earlier. The line moved forward and Richard found himself 2 customers away from the counter. That's when he first noticed her. The young woman at the 3rd teller window looked to be in her mid-20s. with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her name tag read Melissa. Unlike some of the other tellers he'd encountered on his undercover journey, she wasn't rushing through transactions. She took time with each customer, making eye contact and offering a genuine smile that reached her eyes. As Richard watched, an older gentleman approached her window. He seemed confused about something, shuffling through papers with shaky hands. Instead of showing impatience, Melissa leaned forward slightly, speaking softly and pointing to different parts of the documents. The man nodded gratefully, his shoulders relaxing as she explained whatever had been troubling him. There was something familiar about her approach that reminded Richard of the bank's early days, when customer relationships had been the foundation of their business model, before algorithms and efficiency metrics had taken center stage. The customer ahead of Richard finished his transaction and moved away from the counter. Richard stepped forward, ready to approach the next available teller, when he heard something that made him pause, a small, stifled sound coming from Melissa's direction. The older gentleman had left, and Melissa was momentarily alone at her station. She turned slightly away from the counter, reaching for something beneath her desk. That's when Richard saw her face. The smile that had been there moments before was gone. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and as she quickly wiped at her cheek, Richard realized she was fighting back tears. It happened so quickly that Richard wondered if he'd imagined it. But then their eyes met briefly across the room, and something in her expression, a flash of vulnerability quickly masked by professionalism, told him that what he'd seen was real. "Next customer, please," called the teller at the second window, breaking Richard's focus. Richard hesitated, then made a split-second decision. He let the person behind him go ahead, and instead moved toward Melissa's window, which now had no line. As he approached, he watched her take a deep breath and straighten her shoulders, composing herself with visible effort. "Good morning," she said as he reached her counter. Her voice was steady, but Richard could see the remnants of emotion in her eyes. "How can I help you today?" "I'd like to open a savings account," Richard said, setting his fake ID on the counter. "Just moved to the area." "Welcome to the neighborhood," Melissa replied with practiced warmth. "I'll be happy to help you with that." As she began typing his information into the computer, Richard noticed her hands trembling slightly. She paused once to take a sip from a water bottle beside her, and he caught sight of a small photo tucked next to her computer. A young boy, maybe 5 or 6 years old, missing his front teeth in a wide grin. "Is that your son?" Richard asked, hoping to establish some rapport. Melissa glanced at the photo, and a genuine smile briefly crossed her face. "Yes, that's Tyler. He's 6. He looks like a happy kid," Richard said. "He is. Most of the time." Something in her voice shifted, becoming tighter. "He's having a tough week, though. School play is tomorrow, and I promised I'd be there, but—" She trailed off, catching herself. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear about my personal life. Let's get back to your account." Under normal circumstances, Richard would have respected her desire to keep things professional. But he wasn't here under normal circumstances. He was here to understand what was really happening in his branches, beyond the polished reports that reached his desk. "It's okay," he said gently. "Sometimes it helps to talk. Is everything all right?" Melissa looked up, seeming surprised by the genuine concern in his voice. For a moment, Richard worried that his disguise had failed, that she somehow recognized him as the CEO whose picture hung in the break room. But her next words confirmed she had no idea who he really was. "It's just been a rough morning," she said, lowering her voice. "One of our tellers called in sick again, so I'm working a double shift. Which means I'll miss Tyler's play tomorrow." She blinked rapidly. "He has 3 lines. He's been practicing for weeks." Richard felt a twinge of guilt. Staff shortages had been highlighted in recent reports, but the executive team had decided to hold off on new hires until the next quarter to improve the bottom line. It had seemed like a reasonable business decision in the boardroom. Now, seeing the human impact, it felt anything but reasonable. "I'm sorry to hear that," Richard said. "Can't someone cover for you?" "Just for a couple hours?" Melissa gave a small, humorless laugh. "I already asked. Branch policy says we need minimum staffing levels. With Diane out sick, that means I stay. End of story." As she continued setting up his account, Richard noticed how tired she looked beneath her professional demeanor. Not just tired from a long day, but the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from fighting too many battles for too long. "You must really like working here," he said. To put up with missing important moments like that. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She paused, looking thoughtful. "I used to love it," she said finally. "I've been here 5 years. Started right after community college. This branch used to feel like family." She glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "But things have changed. New management, new policies. Everything's about numbers now. How many accounts you open, how fast you process transactions, how many credit cards you sell." Richard felt each word like a physical blow. This was exactly what he'd feared. That somewhere between the executive suite and the teller windows, the bank's values had gotten lost in translation. "What about the customers?" he asked. "That's just it," Melissa said, a flash of passion breaking through her fatigue. "I became a banker because I wanted to help people with their finances, to be part of their lives, to watch their kids grow up and help them save for college." She gestured subtly toward an elderly couple sitting with another bank employee, "to help people like the Wilsons protect their retirement. But now we're just expected to push products, hit targets." A phone rang nearby and Melissa glanced toward the branch manager's office. Her professional mask slipped back into place. "I'm sorry," she said, returning her attention to the computer screen. "I shouldn't be telling you all this. It's just been a long week." She forced a smile. "Your savings account is almost ready. I just need you to review this information." She turned the monitor toward him, but Richard barely saw it. His mind was racing, processing everything she'd just told him. This wasn't just about one employee having a bad day. This was systemic. If Melissa's experience was typical, then national trust had strayed far from the values he thought he'd instilled throughout the organization. "Mr. Bailey?" Melissa prompted. "Is the information correct?" Richard blinked, remembering his cover name. "Yes, sorry. It all looks good." As she finished setting up the account, Richard noticed the branch manager emerging from his office. A man in his 40s with slicked back hair and an expensive-looking suit. He moved through the branch with an air of authority, stopping to peer over another teller's shoulder. The teller immediately sat up straighter, her movements becoming more hurried. "That's Mr. Reynolds," Melissa said quietly, following Richard's gaze. "Regional sent him to improve our metrics, and he has, on paper at least. We're processing more transactions than ever." She handed Richard his new account documents. "We've also lost 6 staff members in 4 months." The branch manager noticed them looking and started walking toward Melissa's window. Richard saw her tense up, her spine straightening, her expression becoming neutral. "Thank you so much for your help today," Richard said quickly, wanting to protect her from any suspicion. "You've made opening this account a very pleasant experience." "Just doing my job, Mr. Bailey," she replied, the warmth in her voice now carefully measured. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The branch manager hovered nearby, clearly listening. "No, that's all," Richard said, gathering his documents. Then, making a split-second decision, he added, "Actually, I was wondering, do you have any branch events coming up? Community things?" Melissa looked briefly confused. Then understanding dawned in her eyes. "Yes, we have a financial literacy workshop next Tuesday evening. For parents and children, it's free." "Sounds perfect," Richard said. "My nephew might benefit from that." He had no nephew, but he needed a reason to return. "I'll bring him by." As he turned to leave, he heard the branch manager addressing Melissa in a low, stern voice. "That transaction took nearly 12 minutes. The standard is 8. We've talked about this before." Richard walked out of the bank, his mind whirling with everything he'd just witnessed. The cold efficiency he'd seen at other branches was bad enough, but this was worse. A culture of fear masked by a thin veneer of professionalism. Employees like Melissa were caught in the middle, trying to maintain human connections with customers while being pushed to behave like machines. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the bank's logo on the building. The blue and silver emblem had once represented trust, stability, and community service. What did it stand for now? Richard pulled out his phone and called Priya. "I need everything you can find on the staffing policies at our branches," he said when she answered. "Particularly how scheduling decisions are made. And I need the personnel file for a teller named Melissa at the Westridge branch." "Did something happen?" Priya asked, concern evident in her voice. Richard watched as the branch manager appeared in the window, speaking to another employee who nodded repeatedly, looking tense. "Yes," he said quietly. I think I just found out what we've lost. Richard sat in his apartment that evening, surrounded by papers and his laptop. The fake glasses lay discarded on the coffee table. He'd spent the afternoon in his home office reviewing everything Priya had sent him about the Westridge branch and its employees. Melissa Thompson had been with National Trust for 5 years. Started as a part-time teller while finishing community college, then moved to full-time. Her performance reviews were consistently positive until the last 18 months, when notes about efficiency concerns and failure to meet sales targets began appearing. The change coincided perfectly with the arrival of Reynolds as branch manager. Reynolds himself had been promoted rapidly through the ranks, moving from branch to branch. Each location showed the same pattern: increased efficiency metrics, higher product sales, and staff turnover that headquarters apparently considered acceptable collateral damage. Richard rubbed his eyes, feeling a headache building. How had he missed this? How had the warm, community-focused bank he thought he was running transformed into this numbers-driven machine? The answer was there in the quarterly reports. 2 years ago, facing pressure from shareholders and the board, Richard had approved a new incentive structure for regional and branch managers. The goal had been simple: reward those who improved efficiency and sales. The unintended consequence now seemed painfully obvious. They'd created a system where treating employees like machines was the fastest path to promotion. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda. "Coming home soon?" Richard replied that he needed another hour. She knew about his Undercover project, but not the details of what he'd discovered. That conversation would have to wait. He turned back to his laptop, pulling up the employee handbook. The section on scheduling had been revised last year, another change he'd signed off on without fully understanding its impact. The new policy prioritized operational efficiency and gave branch managers wide latitude in scheduling decisions. There was a brief mention of accommodating personal obligations, when possible, but no clear guidelines on what that meant. No wonder Melissa couldn't get time off for her son's play. Reynolds was well within his authority to deny the request if it meant the branch would be understaffed. The policy protected the bank's operations at the expense of its people. Richard closed the laptop, his decision made. Tomorrow he would return to the Westridge branch, not as Tom Bailey, but as himself, Richard Harmon, CEO of National Trust. He would speak to Reynolds directly, then to Melissa. But as he lay in bed that night, doubt crept in. Would a single intervention really change anything? Reynolds wasn't the problem. He was a symptom. The real issue was deeper, embedded in policies and incentives Richard himself had approved. Morning came, and with it a change of plan. Richard texted Priya, "Need more time undercover. Extend my conference by 3 days." Her reply came quickly. "Already done. Board thinks you're networking with European partners. What's happening?" "Not sure yet," he wrote back. "But I think we've lost our way." Instead of revealing himself at the Westridge branch, Richard decided to dig deeper. He spent the next 2 days visiting more branches across the city, this time with focused questions about scheduling, sales pressure, and management style. The pattern was consistent. Branches that performed best on paper often had the most stressed employees and highest turnover. At one location, a teller who'd been with the bank for 20 years told him she was counting the days until retirement. "This isn't the place I joined," she said when Richard expressed interest in working there. "Used to be we cared about people. Now we care about numbers." By the 3rd day, Richard had compiled enough evidence to know that sweeping changes were needed. But he still felt drawn back to Westridge, to Melissa and her story. There was something about her situation that encapsulated everything that had gone wrong. The financial literacy workshop she'd mentioned was scheduled for that evening. Richard arrived early, taking a seat in the branch's small community room. A few families trickled in, mostly parents with children ranging from elementary to high school age. Melissa entered the room carrying a stack of handouts. She looked even more tired than before, but managed a warm smile for each family. Richard noticed she wore the same clothes as during their previous encounter, reinforcing her comment about working a double shift. She didn't recognize him at first, busy setting up the workshop. When she finally spotted him sitting alone in the back row, confusion crossed her face. "Mr. Bailey?" she said, approaching him. "I thought you were bringing your nephew." "He couldn't make it," Richard improvised. "But I was interested in the workshop myself. Hope that's okay. Of course, she said. Everyone's welcome. She lowered her voice. Though most adults find it pretty basic. It's mainly for the kids. I'm sure I'll learn something, Richard replied. Besides, you seemed passionate about helping people understand finances. I wanted to see that in action. Something in his tone made her look at him more carefully. For a moment, Richard worried she might see through his disguise. But she simply smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her tired face. Thank you, she said. That's probably the nicest thing anyone from management has said to me in months. Richard felt a pang of guilt. I'm not management, just a customer. Sorry, she said with a small laugh. Force of habit. Anyone in a button-down shirt who asks questions gets categorized as potential management in my head. Before Richard could respond, Reynolds appeared at the door, surveying the small gathering with obvious disappointment. He beckoned to Melissa, who excused herself. Richard couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language told the story. Reynolds gesturing at the sparse attendants, Melissa nodding with slumped shoulders. When she returned to the front of the room to begin the workshop, her smile seemed forced. Despite this, once she started speaking about saving strategies for children, her natural warmth emerged. She engaged the kids with simple games about needs versus wants, using examples they could understand. One little boy proudly announced he was saving for a bike, and Melissa helped him calculate how long it would take at his current allowance rate. Richard watched, impressed by her skill and genuine care. This was exactly the kind of community connection that had once been at the heart of National Trust's mission. After the workshop, as families filtered out, Richard approached Melissa. That was excellent, he said. You have a real talent for teaching. Thanks, she replied, gathering her materials. I enjoy it. We used to do these workshops twice a month, but now it's just once a quarter. Not enough measurable ROI, according to Mr. Reynolds. Richard frowned. That's unfortunate. It seems valuable to me. To me too, Melissa said. She glanced toward Reynolds' office, where the manager was visible through the glass typing at his computer. But what do I know? I'm just a teller. The dismissive way she referred to herself bothered Richard deeply. How was your son's play? He asked, changing the subject. Pain flashed across her face. I missed it. My mother recorded it on her phone. She forced a smile. Technology, right? At least I got to see it eventually. Richard nodded, unsure what to say. No recording could replace being there in person, and they both knew it. How's the new account working out? She asked, clearly wanting to move the conversation to safer ground. Fine, Richard said. Then, making a decision, he added, Actually, I had a question about your flexible banking options. Do you have time to discuss them, or do you need to clock out? Melissa checked her watch. I have about 15 minutes before I need to catch my bus. What would you like to know? Richard led her to a small table in the corner of the community room, positioning himself so Reynolds couldn't see them from his office. Then he took a deep breath. Melissa, I haven't been entirely honest with you. My name isn't Tom Bailey. He removed his fake glasses, meeting her eyes directly. I'm Richard Harmon. I'm the CEO of National Trust. Her face went pale. She glanced toward the exit as if contemplating escape. Please, Richard said quickly, keeping his voice low. I'm not here to get anyone in trouble. Quite the opposite. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you pretend to be a customer? Because I wanted to see how our branches really operate. Not the polished version that gets reported up the chain, but the day-to-day reality. He leaned forward. And what I've seen concerns me deeply. Melissa's shock was giving way to wariness. Is this some kind of test? Did Reynolds put you up to this? No, Richard said firmly. Reynolds has no idea who I am. No one does, except my assistant and my wife. He pulled out his actual ID, showing it to her briefly before returning it to his pocket. I've spent the last week visiting branches incognito. What I've found is that somewhere between my office and the teller windows our values got lost. Melissa studied his face, looking for deception. Finding none, her shoulders relaxed slightly. So what happens now? You fire Reynolds and things go back to normal for a few weeks until the next metrics-obsessed manager takes his place? Her bluntness surprised Richard, but he appreciated it. No, that wouldn't solve anything. He took out a business card, his real one, and wrote his personal cell number on the back. What happens now is I listen. Really listen. To you and others like you who are on the front lines every day. He slid the card across the table. If you're willing, I'd like you to tell me everything. The good, the bad, and the ugly. What's working, what isn't, and what needs to change. Melissa stared at the card, then back at Richard. Why me? Richard thought about the tears he'd seen her fighting back, about her missed opportunity to see her sons play, about the genuine care she showed customers despite everything. Because you still care, he said simply. Despite a system that's pushing you not to, you still care about our customers and what this bank is supposed to stand for. That's exactly the perspective I need right now. For a long moment, Melissa was silent, turning the business card over in her hands. Then she looked up with determination in her eyes. When do we start? The next morning, Richard sat in a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the Westridge branch. He'd arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table away from the windows. His disguise was gone, no more fake glasses or rumpled clothes. Today he wore what Melissa would expect from a CEO, a tailored suit and polished shoes. The door opened and Melissa walked in, scanning the room. She looked different outside the bank, more relaxed in jeans and a simple sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. When she spotted Richard, a flicker of nervousness crossed her face before she straightened her posture and approached his table. I half expected you not to be here, she said, sliding into the chair across from him. I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Richard smiled. I'm real, I promise. Thank you for coming. He pushed a coffee cup toward her. I ordered for both of us. Hope that's okay. Melissa accepted the cup with a nod of thanks. So, what exactly are we doing here, Mr. Harmon? Richard, please. He leaned forward. And what we're doing is simple. I need to understand what's really happening in my bank, from someone who sees it every day, not filtered through 10 layers of management. Melissa took a sip of coffee, watching him over the rim of her cup. And you picked me because you were honest when you didn't know who I was. Because you care about the customers and your colleagues. Richard paused. And because I saw how Reynolds treated you and I want to know if that's typical. Melissa was quiet for a moment, stirring her coffee. When she looked up, her expression was serious. Before I say anything, I need to know, is this conversation going to cost me my job? Because I'm a single mom and I can't afford to. No, Richard interrupted firmly. Absolutely not. Whatever you tell me stays between us. You have my word. She studied his face, then nodded, apparently satisfied with what she saw. Okay, where do you want me to start? Wherever you think is most important. Melissa took a deep breath. The biggest problem isn't Reynolds, though he's part of it. It's that somewhere along the line, the bank stopped seeing us as people. We became numbers on a spreadsheet. Transactions per hour, products sold, metrics. As she spoke, Richard took notes, occasionally asking questions but mostly listening. Melissa described how the atmosphere had changed over her 5 years with the bank, from a collaborative environment where employees helped each other to a competitive one where everyone feared missing their targets. The worst part, she said, is what it's doing to customer service. I had an elderly couple last week who needed help understanding their statement. Took 20 minutes to walk them through it. Reynolds pulled me aside afterward and told me I was wasting time on low-value interactions. She shook her head in disgust. These people have banked with us for 30 years. How is helping them a waste? Richard winced. This was exactly the kind of short-term thinking he'd been hearing about all week. Tell me about the scheduling issues, he prompted. The reason you missed your son's play. Melissa's expression tightened. That's another thing. We used to have flexibility. If someone needed a specific day off for something important, we'd cover for each other. Now everything's dictated by an algorithm that doesn't care if it's your kid's birthday or your mother's funeral. But there must be exceptions for important events, Richard said, thinking of the family-friendly policies he thought were in place. On paper, sure. In reality, the branch has to meet minimum staffing levels, and those levels don't account for how busy we actually are, or how experienced the staff is. Melissa looked down at her hands. So when Diane called in sick, someone had to cover. That someone was me, because I'm the newest full-timer. Richard made another note. What would have made that situation better? Besides Diane not getting sick, I mean. Melissa thought for a moment. Having enough staff that one absence doesn't create a crisis. Having managers empowered to make judgment calls based on human needs, not just numbers. She gave a bitter laugh. Having a bank that remembers its employees have lives outside those walls. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Melissa's insights were invaluable. Specific examples of policies that looked good from headquarters but failed in practice. By the time they finished their second round of coffee, Richard had filled several pages with notes. There's one more thing, Melissa said as they prepared to leave. The community programs. They're being cut everywhere, not just at our branch. The financial literacy workshops, the first-time homebuyer seminars, the retirement planning sessions, they're all disappearing because they don't generate immediate revenue. Richard frowned. Those programs had been central to National Trust's identity. That wasn't supposed to happen. The budget for community outreach was maintained. Maybe on paper, Melissa replied. But in reality, branches get rewarded for sales, not service. So guess which one gets prioritized? Outside the coffee shop, Richard thanked her for her honesty. This has been incredibly helpful. More than you know. Melissa hesitated, then asked, "What happens now? Will anything actually change?" It was a fair question. "Yes," Richard said with conviction. "I promise you that. It may take time, but things will change." "I've heard promises before," she said, not unkindly. "I know. And I understand your skepticism." Richard met her gaze. "But I built this bank on values that seem to have gotten lost. This conversation is just the beginning of finding them again." Melissa nodded, not fully convinced but willing to hope. As she turned to leave, Richard added, "One more thing, I'd like to meet your son." "Tyler, right? The actor?" Her face softened at the mention of her son. "Why?" "Because I owe him an apology. My bank made his mom miss his play. The least I can do is tell him it won't happen again." For the first time that morning, Melissa smiled fully. "He'd like that. He's in a baseball game this Saturday at Jefferson Park, 10 o'clock. I'll be there," Richard promised. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Richard returned to his office officially, ending his European conference early. He called an emergency meeting with his executive team, laying out what he'd discovered during his undercover journey. Some were defensive, pointing to the bank's strong financial performance. Others seemed genuinely shocked by the disconnect between policy and practice. Richard listened to all perspectives but made one thing clear: change was coming, with or without their support. He tasked Priya with organizing a series of focus groups across all branches, giving employees at every level a chance to speak freely about their experiences. In the meantime, he personally reviewed the metrics used to evaluate branch performance, questioning which truly aligned with the bank's core values. By Friday, he had drafted the outline of a new strategic plan centered on balancing operational efficiency with employee well-being and customer relationships. The board would need to approve it, but Richard was prepared to fight for these changes. Saturday morning found him at Jefferson Park, watching from the bleachers as Tyler's team took the field. The boy was small for his age but moved with confidence as he took his position at second base. Melissa sat a few rows down, unaware of Richard's presence until he approached during a break between innings. "You came?" she said. Surprise evident in her voice. "I promised I would." Richard nodded toward the field. "He's good. He tries hard," Melissa said with a mother's pride. "That's what matters." When the game ended, Tyler's team lost by 2 runs, but the boy had made an impressive catch. Melissa called him over. "Tyler, this is Mr. Harmon. He's a friend from work." Richard knelt to the boy's level. "Great game out there. That catch in the 4th inning was something special." Tyler beamed, his disappointment over the loss momentarily forgotten. "Thanks, Mom said you're her boss's boss's boss. Like the biggest boss of all." Richard laughed. "Something like that. Does that mean you can give her the day off for my next play?" She missed the last one. The directness of children could be brutal. Richard saw Melissa wince, but he answered seriously. "Actually, yes. That's exactly what it means. And I'm sorry she missed your play. That shouldn't have happened." Tyler studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Okay, you can come to the next one too if you want. I'm playing a tree, but it's an important tree." "I'd be honored," Richard said, meaning it. As Tyler ran off to join his teammates, Melissa shook her head in amazement. "I've never seen a CEO at a Little League game before." "Maybe that's part of the problem," Richard replied. "We get so caught up in boardrooms and balance sheets that we forget what actually matters." On Monday morning, Richard called Reynolds into his office. The branch manager arrived looking nervous but defiant, clearly expecting a confrontation about his management style. Instead, Richard asked him a simple question. "Why did you become a banker?" Confused, Reynolds stammered something about career advancement and financial stability. "No," Richard pressed. "Why banking specifically? What drew you to this industry?" After a moment's thought, Reynolds admitted that he'd initially wanted to help people achieve financial security. His first manager had taught him the satisfaction of seeing a customer buy their first home or send a child to college because of sound financial planning. "What happened to that guy?" Richard asked gently. Reynolds looked away. "He got lost somewhere between quarterly targets and performance reviews." "I think a lot of us did," Richard agreed. "But it's not too late to find our way back." Over the next hour, they had an honest conversation about the pressure Reynolds felt to deliver results, the metrics that drove his decisions, and the toll it was taking on his branch. By the time he left, Reynolds had agreed to participate in developing new guidelines for branch management, ones that balanced performance with people. It was just one conversation with one manager, but it represented something larger. The beginning of change. The rediscovery of values that had been temporarily forgotten but never truly lost. That afternoon, Richard stood before the board of directors, presenting his findings and his vision for National Trust's future. Some members shifted uncomfortably as he described the disconnect between corporate policies and frontline realities. Others nodded in recognition, perhaps remembering the bank's original mission. "We've lost our way," Richard concluded. "But thanks to the courage of our employees, people like Melissa Thompson, who care enough to tell the truth even when it's difficult, we now have a chance to find it again. To rebuild National Trust as a bank that values people as much as profits, that remembers why we exist in the first place, to serve our communities, not just our shareholders." He looked around the room, meeting each board member's eyes. "The question is, are we brave enough to take that chance?" 3 months passed quickly. Spring turned to summer, bringing long days and warm evenings. At National Trust headquarters, the windows of the executive floor stood open, letting in a gentle breeze as Richard reviewed the latest reports from the branches. These weren't the same sterile spreadsheets he'd relied on before. Alongside the traditional metrics of transactions and revenue, new columns tracked employee satisfaction, work-life balance, and community engagement. The numbers told a story of transformation, not complete, not perfect, but real. Richard set down the tablet and checked his watch. Almost time. He straightened his tie and grabbed his jacket, feeling a mix of nervousness and anticipation. Today marked the official launch of National Trust's People First initiative across all 300 branches. The press release had gone out that morning, and the financial news channels were already buzzing with analysis. Some praised the bank for its bold vision. Others questioned whether prioritizing employees and community would hurt the bottom line. Richard didn't care about the skeptics. He'd seen firsthand what happened when a bank forgot its purpose, when it treated people like numbers. He wouldn't make that mistake again. His phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "They're ready for you in the conference room." Richard took a deep breath and headed downstairs, where branch managers from across the city had gathered for the kickoff meeting. As he entered, conversations hushed, all eyes turning to him. He spotted Reynolds near the back, looking uncomfortable but present. "Good morning," Richard began, moving to the front of the room.
"Thank you all for being here."
"Today marks a new chapter for National Trust, a return to our founding values and a commitment to putting people at the center of everything we do." He outlined the changes they'd been developing over the past 3 months. A new scheduling system that prioritized work-life balance, revised performance metrics that valued quality of service alongside quantity, increased staffing levels to reduce pressure on frontline employees, and a renewed emphasis on community programs. None of this happened overnight, Richard acknowledged, and none of it would have happened at all without the courage of our employees who spoke up about what wasn't working. He nodded to the back of the room, where Melissa stood quietly by the door. She'd arrived late, slipping in just as the meeting began. At Richard's acknowledgement, several heads turned in her direction. Melissa Thompson from our Westridge branch was one of those voices. Richard continued. "She reminded me what banking is supposed to be about. Not just transactions and profits, but relationships and trust." Melissa looked surprised at being singled out, her cheeks flushing slightly. But she stood a little straighter, accepting the recognition with dignity. "There will be challenges ahead," Richard told the group. "Change isn't easy. Some of our shareholders are nervous. Some of our competitors think we've lost our minds." He smiled. "But I believe that by realigning our practices with our values, we'll build a stronger bank, one that serves its customers better, treats its employees fairly, and contributes meaningfully to our communities. After the meeting, as managers mingled over coffee, Richard made his way to Melissa. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "It still feels strange, being invited to headquarters, having the CEO know my name." "You deserve the recognition," Richard said. "Without your honesty that day, none of this might have happened." Melissa shook her head. "I just answered your questions. You're the one who actually did something about it." "That's my job," Richard replied simply. "Speaking of which, I have a proposition for you." He explained that as part of the new initiative, National Trust was creating a position at each regional office, Employee Advocacy Coordinator. The role would serve as a bridge between frontline staff and management, ensuring that employee concerns were heard and addressed before they became systemic problems. "I'd like you to take on that role for the Western region," Richard said. "You have exactly the perspective and communication skills we need." Melissa looked stunned. "Me? But I'm just a teller." "You're never just anything," Richard corrected gently. "You're someone who cares deeply about this bank and its people. Someone who speaks truth even when it's difficult. That's exactly what this position requires." Melissa considered the offer, her expression thoughtful. "What about Tyler? Would the hours be flexible enough for a single parent?" "Absolutely," Richard assured her. "We've completely revised our approach to work-life balance. You'd help shape those policies going forward." After a moment, Melissa nodded. "In that case, yes. I'd be honored." Later that afternoon, Richard visited the Westridge branch, not in disguise this time, but openly as CEO. He'd made a point of visiting different branches each week, talking directly with employees and customers. Today's visit held special significance, though. This was where it had all started, with a teller's stifled tears. The branch looked different somehow. The same physical space, but the atmosphere had changed. Employees moved with purpose, but without the frantic energy he'd noticed before. Customers were engaged in actual conversations with staff, not just hurried transactions. Reynolds spotted him first, coming forward to shake his hand. The branch manager had undergone his own transformation in recent months. After their honest conversation in Richard's office, Reynolds had embraced the challenge of redefining success at his branch. It hadn't been easy. Old habits died hard, but the results were beginning to show. "Mr. Harmon," Reynolds greeted him. "Welcome back to Westridge. How's the transition going?" Richard asked. "Better than I expected," Reynolds admitted. "The new scheduling system has reduced sick days by 30%. Turns out when people can balance work and home life, they don't burn out as quickly." He gave a self-deprecating smile. "Took me too long to figure that out." Richard nodded. "We all missed it. That's why we needed a wake-up call." As they walked through the branch, Richard noticed small but meaningful changes. The teller area had been reconfigured to allow for more privacy during transactions. A community bulletin board displayed upcoming financial workshops and local events. In the waiting area, a young mother helped her daughter count coins into a savings account while a patient banker looked on. "Our customer satisfaction scores are actually up," Reynolds commented, following Richard's gaze. "Turns out people appreciate being treated like humans, not numbers." "Imagine that," Richard said with a smile. The door opened and a familiar figure entered. Tyler, Melissa's son, still in his school uniform. He spotted Richard immediately. "Mr. Harmon," he called, rushing over. "Did you see my play? I told you my tree was important." Richard laughed. "I did see it. You were the most impressive tree I've ever seen on stage." Tyler beamed. "Mom says we're moving to a new house closer to her new job, and I can still play baseball with my team because she doesn't have to work weekends anymore." "That sounds wonderful," Richard said, genuinely pleased. "Yeah, and she doesn't cry in the bathroom anymore when she thinks I'm asleep," Tyler added matter-of-factly. Richard's smile faltered slightly at this unexpectedly raw glimpse into what Melissa had been going through. It was a powerful reminder of the real impact workplace policies had on people's lives, not just during office hours, but at home, in private moments when the masks came off. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly. 6 months after Richard's undercover journey, the quarterly results were in. National Trust profits had dipped slightly as expected. Implementing the new policies had required significant investment. But other indicators were promising. Customer retention had improved, employee turnover had decreased dramatically, and new accounts were up. particularly in younger demographics who responded to the bank's renewed community focus. The board meeting to review these results was tense. Some members remained skeptical, pointing to the short-term profit decline as evidence that the new direction was misguided. Richard listened patiently, then presented the long-term projections showing how reduced turnover and increased customer loyalty would ultimately strengthen the bank's position. Banking isn't just about quarterly profits, he reminded them. It's about building relationships that last decades. We lost sight of that for a while, but we're finding our way back. The vote to continue the People First initiative passed narrowly, but it passed. Outside the boardroom, Priya waited with news that made Richard smile. National Trust had just been named one of the best places to work in the financial sector, a first in the bank's history. 1 year to the day after Richard had first walked into the Westridge branch and frozen at the sound of a teller fighting back tears, he stood on a small stage in the company's largest training room. Before him sat nearly 100 employees from across the organization, the first graduating class of National Trust's new leadership development program. The program specifically targeted frontline employees with leadership potential, people who might otherwise have been overlooked by the traditional promotion track. Richard recognized several faces in the crowd, including a few tellers and customer service representatives he'd met during his undercover days. Leadership isn't about titles or corner offices, he told them. It's about service, about putting others first, about remembering that behind every account number is a person with hopes, dreams, and challenges. He scanned the faces before him, feeling a surge of optimism about the bank's future. A year ago, I thought I knew what was happening in my own company. I was wrong. It took someone brave enough to show emotion, even tears, to wake me up to what we were losing. At the back of the room, Melissa stood watching, now in her role as the Western Region's Employee Advocacy Coordinator. Beside her was Tyler, fidgeting slightly in a chair but proud to see his mom recognized at such an important event. The most valuable asset of any organization isn't its buildings or its balance sheet, Richard concluded. It's its people. When we forget that, we lose everything that matters. But when we remember, when we truly put people first, there's nothing we can't accomplish together. As applause filled the room, Richard caught Melissa's eye and gave her a small nod of gratitude. One moment of honest emotion had sparked a transformation that would touch thousands of lives. One person had made all the difference. Sometimes the most important sound a leader could hear was the sound of someone caring enough to cry,